Good morning and welcome to Calvary Baptist Church. We're glad that you decided to join us today as we finish up our series looking at some of the old Bible school stories and digging a little bit deeper into them. And so we're going to be sort of just switching gears this next week. We're going to be doing something different, but we will probably revisit going through the Sunday school stories at another time, but we're going to finish up this week with what I'm entitling The Prince of Egypt and the Passover. And so we're going to be looking at the life of Moses a little bit and up to the Passover. And so we're going to be covering quite a bit of ground, but it is just an amazing story. I just didn't want to end this series without being able to cover this. And so we will get back to Isaac and Joseph and Jacob and all them. We will get back to those at another time. So if you were interested in those, don't worry, we will get back to them. But I do want to share with you the story of Moses. And so let's go ahead and ask the Lord to be with us in this time that we have today, and we'll just go ahead and get started. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you so much this day. Thank you for all that you've blessed us with. Lord, keep us from the struggles of this life. Help us to do what you'd have us to do, to be successful in a way that would give you honor and glory, Lord, to just be able to tackle the challenges that's in front of us, Lord, that we can live a life that is honoring to you. Lord, be with us, guide us, direct us in this time. Help us to see what you'd have us to see in your word. Help us to just come out of this a little bit more like your son. We ask all this in your holy name, Lord Jesus. Amen. All right, well, to talk about Moses, it's kind of amazing is we have to go back to cover some ground that we've already covered with Abraham, and we're going to go back to that moment where God makes his covenant with who at the time was still named Abram. And remember, he was asking, how am I going to know for sure that I'm going to have this son? How am I going to know for sure what you're going to do for me? And God ended up making a covenant with Abraham, or Abram at the time. And he also let him in on sort of what was going to happen to his descendants. And Abram had got to see, even though it was kind of a scary and terrifying sight, he got to see what his descendants would be going through in the land of Egypt and how they would be leaving, and not just leaving because God brought them out, but God brought them out and they plundered the biggest and richest country in the world at that time. And so it's kind of amazing how this happens. But I want us to read this, Genesis chapter 15, starting in verse 12. God's word tells us this. It says, "Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. Then he said to Abram, Know certainly that your descendants will be stranger in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years, and they will 400, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge afterwards. They shall come out with great possessions." Now, we do sort of, it's kind of amazing to see that Abraham, or Abram at the time, Abraham later on, never got to truly see what was going to happen. For me, just a quick overview, basically what happens, Abraham has Isaac. Abraham makes sure that he gets a wife for his son, and his wife has two children, Jacob and Esau, and God chooses the younger rather than the older, which was tradition's sake, that he was going to be the one that was going to inherit the promise and the covenant promise from God. And so Jacob ends up being the one who God is going to bless, and he ends up having 12 sons, and the 11th of the 12 sons ends up getting sold off into slavery by his older brothers because he was the dreamer. He was the one that the brothers didn't care for because he was his father's favorite. Um, and so it ends up that Joseph ends up saving his family. God gives him the ability to interpret dreams, and he ends up giving Joseph the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream as he was sort of sitting out in jail there in Egypt at the time. But when Pharaoh saw that what God was doing through Joseph, and that he gave Egypt and all the people just this great warning, Pharaoh ended up making Joseph number 2 in the kingdom, and put him in charge of preparing for the 7 years of famine. And so Egypt was not only prepared, but they were able to sell food to the surrounding peoples and keep them from starving. And that included Joseph's family, who were in Canaan, who came to Egypt to get food. And Joseph was able to save his family. He was able to bring them from Canaan over to Egypt. Because of what Joseph had done, Pharaoh gave them the land of Goshen, which was just absolute ideal territory for sheep herders and that sort of thing, since many of the Egyptians sort of found that kind of a detestable job. They were off on their own, and yet they were also provided for in a lot of ways. And God blessed them, and they grew. And so they went from under 100 people that originally came to Egypt to, by the time that we get to the story of Moses, and they've been there for 400 years, and they've been afflicted, and they've had these things that God promised to Abram, or showed Abram, happen. They went from what we believe to be 70, 80 people to we're looking at probably 1 million plus, maybe 2 million. And so that is just a massive number of people. And so God had blessed them and made them very fruitful, and they multiplied. And that was one of the reasons that the Egyptians were afraid of them. In fact, they became so numerous, and they were up on the northeastern border of Egypt, that was the reason why this new Pharaoh, who didn't know who Joseph was, who didn't know what he did in saving Egypt and saving the world at that time. And so they were oppressing the people because they thought, if we just leave these people alone, we have enemies that come from the north, these Israelites are just such a massive amount of people that they'll join with our enemies, and that we won't have a chance. And so that's what they thought. And so they treated the Israelites badly. And it comes down to basically the Pharaoh had ordered that all the baby boys who were born were to be thrown into the Nile River, to be basically, as sad as it may be, crocodile chow. And that was terrible. And we see the story of one brave mother who was unwilling to let her child be tossed into the Nile, and we see her bravery and what she did, and that out of that, God ends up calling someone who is going to be a hero to his people. And so we see that in Exodus, the book of Exodus, chapter 2, starting in verse 1. It says, "A man of the house of Levi went and took as a wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months." Now, what's amazing to me as I look at that is, I've had the absolute honor and pleasure of having 3 wonderful children, and I've got to be there in the delivery room. I've seen these kids from the moment they were born all the way up to today, and Lucas and Gracie both just had their birthdays, and it's kind of hard to just think about over the past 8 years and seeing this wonderful miracle 3 times over. But I do know something about little kids, and the fact is they are incredibly noisy. A little baby is not something that is easy to hide. And so it was amazing to see that they were willing to put their lives on the line, because defying Pharaoh carried a death sentence. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And so they were willing to put their lives on the line to protect this baby. But eventually it got to be the point where they could not hide him any longer. And so we see what happens. Verse 3, it says, "But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, dabbed it in asphalt and pitch, and put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would happen to what would be done to him." It says, "Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. When she saw the ark amongst the reeds, she sent her maid to get it, and when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. And she had compassion on him, saying, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.' Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?' And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages.' So a woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. And he became her son, and she called his name Moses, saying, 'Because I drew him out of the water.'" And so here's this amazing event is basically Moses' mom she didn't think that she was going to be able to hide him anymore, and she couldn't bear to see her child die, and so she ended up making a little boat for him, that he would at least float down the river, and maybe by the grace of God something good would happen. And so she did that. She put her son into the river. And it doesn't say, but I've got to imagine that she said a prayer and asked God to protect him. And here's his eldest sister Miriam. She's watching afar off just to see what would happen. She loved her baby brother, and it just so happens that Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe, and so all of her maids and attendants were there with her. And as she was bathing in the river, she saw this basket with the babe in it, and she had it brought over to her, and she opened it up, and here's this little baby boy, and he's upset and he's crying. I mean, I don't know about you, but being put in a boat on the river in 3 months old, I probably wouldn't be very happy either. But Miriam ends up speaking up. Now, this was also, she was putting her life on the line. I mean, here's a Hebrew, one of the slaves, openly addressing the daughter of Pharaoh. And she says, "Would you like me to get a woman to nurse him for you?" And she says, "Yes, go ahead and do that." And so not only did God provide for the protection of Moses, but his mother, who had just put him into the river and was looking for a miracle, received one. She received her boy back in her arms, not only to be able to take care of him until he was weaned, but she got paid to do it. And that's kind of amazing to think about. It is not only did she didn't have to worry about this baby being seen, because she was under the protection of Pharaoh's daughter. And so she had to turn her son back over to Pharaoh's daughter, and he was raised as a prince of Egypt. And you think about this. I mean, here's one of the most educated and all this sort of stuff countries. This was one of the mightiest army, if not the mightiest army. It was the world power at the time. Egypt was the mightiest of all nations in the world at this point. And here's Moses, and he is being raised as a prince of Egypt. He had all sorts of advantages. Even though he was Hebrew, he was still adopted as Pharaoh's daughter's son, and so he had everything that would have been available to him, and it was an amazing thing. And so he grew up being well educated and well taken care of. But he did still love his people. And we see that as we continue on in verse 11. It says, "Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, they went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren, so he looked this way and that. When he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, two Hebrew men were fighting. And he said to one who did the other wrong, why are you striking your companion? And they said, who made you prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. And so he was trying to set things right when he seen this Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew, and maybe he wasn't fulfilling his tasks quick enough or well enough or whatever, but Moses came to his rescue, and he struck the Egyptian down. And, he hid him in the sand and that sort of thing. But when he goes and he sees, the Hebrews fighting amongst each other, he says, why are you fighting? Your brothers, your family. Why would you fight with each other? And they say, who made you prince over us? And so even though he was trying to be kind-hearted, and he was looking out for his people and their well-being, they didn't want anything to do with it. They didn't, feel that he was somebody to be in charge of them or anything of that nature. And so they were asking, are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? And so, here's Moses, and he knows that it's a known thing. He's got to get out of there. And so he flees from Pharaoh, because Pharaoh was sought to kill him. And so he gets out into the wilderness and stuff, gets to the land of Midian. And now here he is, he has nothing. He ran with the clothes that were on his back and had nothing else. And so here's this prince of Egypt who has grown up in most likely some luxury, even though he seen the difficulties of his people. But now he's out there pretty much by himself. Now it sort of happens that he ends up by a well, and at that time, these girls were coming to take care of their animals and all this sort of stuff, and there was some shepherds that came and was giving the girls a hard time, and Moses rescued them, and they watered their flock, and so their father said, hey, invite him in, and so he comes and he gets brought in, and he ends up becoming part of this family, because he ends up marrying this man's daughter named Zipporah. And so him and Zipporah get married, and Moses ends up tending sheep out there for his father-in-law. And so he's out there in the wilderness for actually a good number of years. And we see that God is going to call him to go and to rescue God's people, his people. And we see that as we get to chapter 3. Chapter 3, starting verse 1, it says, now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why this bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here am I. Then he said, do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place which you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a good and large land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to a place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression for which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Now, this was great news probably for Moses at the beginning. Oh, you've heard and you've seen, and you're going to rescue your people. That's awesome. But then God says, I'm going to send you. Now remember, he fled from the presence of Pharaoh. Now this was probably, the Pharaoh he was seeking to kill him had probably passed, and they were probably, another pharaoh or two down the line. But they had a movie that came out when I was a kid called The Prince of Egypt, and they supposed, or they had the idea that it might have been Moses's, one of his other Pharaoh's daughter's sons, one of her actual sons that maybe was Pharaoh at that time, and it very well might have been. I mean, that's a possibility at least. And so, he was going to go back to talk to another Pharaoh, and one that he very well might have had a relationship with at one point in time, whether it was as a brother or a cousin or some sort of relative. And so God was going to send him. Now, this had to be terrifying. He ran away from Pharaoh. He ran away from Egypt because of what he'd done. It looked like that was pretty well known, and so God is going to be sending him back. And so, he's worried about that. He ends up talking with God and sort of arguing with him, saying, "Hey, I'm not the guy you want. I'm not good at speaking, and what do I do if they don't believe me?" And God gives him miracles, and God tells him to have his brother Aaron to speak on his behalf if he was afraid to speak. And we get to where Moses and Aaron, his elder brother, Miriam's brother also as well, they're going to be going, or Aaron and Moses are going to be going in front of Pharaoh. And let's go over to chapter 7. And I want you to see this interaction. So the Lord said to Moses, "See, I've made you as God to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and Aaron your brother shall tell Pharaoh to send the children of Israel out of his land, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh will not heed you, so that I may lay my hand on Egypt and bring my armies and my people and children of Israel out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, and I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them." Then Moses and Aaron did so, just as the Lord commanded them, so they did. And Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 years old, when they spoke to Pharaoh. And so, he'd been out in the wilderness a long time. And yet here he is doing what the Lord had asked him, and he's going and speaking to Pharaoh at 80 years old. And he's already told that Pharaoh is not going to listen to you, that God is going to be doing signs and wonders and showing himself mighty on the world stage. And so, this is with many times we see that God had blessed Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and had done some amazing things. But God and Egypt is the time that God is really announcing himself on the world stage for the first time since the Great Flood and the confusing of the languages. And so it's been a very long time, a long period of quiet from God. But we're going to see that he is going to use this moment to declare his power and his majesty as he is going to rescue his people. And so we see that God tells Moses that he is going to bring them out by signs and wonders, and unfortunately these become what we know today as the 10 plagues of Egypt. And these plagues were horrible, and any one of these would have anybody who is truly thinking would have been willing to stop with any of these plagues, but God allowed Pharaoh to harden his heart and to consistently decide not to let the people go, and we see that. So when we look at the plagues, the very first plague was, Moses and Aaron had went to the Nile, and they were talking to Pharaoh as he was on a boat, and the river was turned to blood. And so, everything that was in the Nile River had died. And when you look at Egypt, they are so critically dependent upon the Nile River. I mean, it is it is the lifeblood of Egypt. And so the whole river turned to blood. The fish died. I mean, the smell was terrible. All this, and that wouldn't change Pharaoh's heart. Then there came a plague of frogs, and we have frogs up here in northern Indiana, and you go outside and you hear them croaking and ribbiting and all this sort of stuff. But can you imagine everywhere you step, you open the cabinet, some frogs are pouring out of it. You lay down, you have frogs jumping on your head and on your face and maybe getting in your mouth. I don't know. Ugh. But frogs everywhere. And that wasn't enough to change Pharaoh. Then there was a plague of lice, and I remember as a kid I had lice, and it still makes my skin crawl. And can you imagine there just being lice everywhere and on everybody, and it's terrible. And then flies, and we every once in a while you'll see a gnat swarm and stuff, and it's terrible, and you choke and you cough when you swallow about 50 gnats and all this sort of stuff. But can you imagine flies? And you get like one or two flies in your house, and they fly and they land on you, and it's just annoying to hear their buzz and their wings by you and all this sort of stuff. And about drives you nuts that you're going to find any sort of fly swatter you can to get rid of them. But I mean, think about the air is just covered with them. I mean, everything, they're everywhere. Have hundreds upon hundreds of them in your house. It would be torture. I mean, it'd be torture. But still, that Pharaoh wouldn't listen. The fifth plague was a plague upon the cattle, and so most, if not a majority of the cattle of Egypt dies, and so cows and all this sort of stuff, and it just keels over and dies in the field. I mean, terrible. But he wouldn't listen then. So now Egypt is being attacked. All these different attacks also sort of fly directly in the face of the Egyptian gods. And there was gods of the river, and there was a god of frogs, and there was a god, and yet God was saying, I am mightier than this god and this god and this god and this god. And we even have boils, that the Egyptians were covered in painful sores from the top of their head to the bottom of their feet. And these plagues, while they were affecting Egypt, they were not affecting the land of Goshen. And so God was distinguishing between his people and the Egyptians. And so, this borderline, that you would see all these plagues going on in Egypt, but yet as you looked over into Goshen, there would be nothing. Then one of the most difficult for us to comprehend type of situation, that there was hail mixed with fire. Now Moses had warned that this was going to happen, and so many of the Egyptians who feared God, they stayed inside. They had what animals they had left, they kept them inside, but many people and many things were out in the field, and they were crushed by giant hailstones, and there was fireballs in this. I mean, can you imagine the devastation and destruction this caused? And yet Pharaoh would not move. His heart was still hardened. He would not yield and say that God was in charge and that his people could go. The next plague was a plague of locusts, and locusts are similar to grasshoppers in a way, and all this sort of stuff, and we have those up here too, and you see them every once in a while. But a plague of locusts, I mean, it was just, they were everywhere, and they eat everything. I mean, the things that weren't destroyed by the hail and the fire and the plagues and all this sort of stuff, it was completely eaten. I mean, there was nothing left of Egypt's wealth as far as crops or animals. I mean, it was all taken from them. And yet Pharaoh would not let the people go. Then they had the plague that had to be one of the craziest ones to see, a plague of darkness. And the darkness was so dark, it was so heavy that it said that you could feel the weight upon yourself. And there was a line between Goshen and Egypt, and so literally on one side of the border it was sunny bright as day, on the other is like a dome of blackness. that there was no light, and so the people, they didn't move for 3 days. But then after all those plagues, we're going to get to chapter 12, and we're going to see as the Passover is instituted, because this next plague is going to be so severe, it's going to cause so much grief, so much heartache, that Pharaoh is going to demand that they leave in the middle of the night. And it is going to be the death of the firstborn. And so we're going to see how God ends up giving a pass. He that's why Passover is, they're going to put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts. And how this is such an amazing picture of what Jesus was going to come to do in the New Testament, that is the blood of Jesus that is on the doorposts of our heart, that when the Lord sees us, he doesn't see our sin, he sees the blood of his Son, and he sees his righteousness has been imputed upon us, who's been given to us as we gave our life of sinfulness back to Jesus. And he said, I will take that from you. And so as we read this, I want you to see just the amazing thing as we go through. And so this is going to be a large passage we're going to read. We're going to read verse 1 through 36. So this is most of the chapter. So hang on with me as we read through this. Exodus chapter 12, starting verse 1, it says, Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be the beginning of months, and shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of persons, according to each man's need. You shall take your account for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You will take it from the sheep, or you may take it from the sheep or the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. The whole assembly with the congregation of the Israel shall kill it at twilight, and they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. And they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat it. Do not eat it raw or boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire, and thus you shall eat it with your belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I'll pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So this day shall be to you a memorial, that you shall keep it as a feast unto the Lord for your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation. On the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that everyone must eat that only may be prepared by you. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for this is the same day I will have brought out your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore ye shall observe this day, and throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses. Since whoever eats what is leavened, the same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel. Whether he is stranger or native to the land, you shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, Pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families, and kill the Passover lamb. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in this basin. And none of you shall go out of this door until of his house until morning. For the Lord will pass through and strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door, and not allow the destroyer to come to your house to strike you. And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. It will come to pass when you come to a land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised, that you shall keep this service. And it shall be, when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? That you shall say, is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households. So people bowed their heads and worshipped, and the children of Israel went away and did so, just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. And it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, and the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all of his servants, the Egyptians. There was a great cry in Egypt, and there was not a house where there was not one dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, rise and go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go and serve the Lord as you have said, and take your flocks and your herds, and you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. And the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we shall all be dead. So people took their dough before it was leavened, having kneaded their kneading bowls bound upon their clothes on their shoulders. And now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they granted them what they requested, and they plundered the Egyptians. I know it's a very long passage to look at, but I wanted you to see that last part because it is a fulfillment of what God had told Abram, that the people would walk out from being slaves to being wealthy. And so they basically took the wealth of Egypt that was left, the gold, the silver, the clothing, all the things that were precious things, the people took with them as they left. And so, God passed over, and so as the death angel was sent, the doorposts with the blood of the lamb that was on it, the death angel passed over them and didn't come to those houses. And so the people of Israel were saved and they were safe. But the Egyptians who didn't have the blood, there was the firstborn in every household was killed, including Pharaoh's. And so, understanding what that meant. I mean, Pharaoh's firstborn son was meant to be the next Pharaoh. And we see when we look at the histories of Egypt, we see that there was one of the pharaohs that we believe that would have been in charge. His son had mysteriously died when he was young and was literally stripped from the record. And so when they were basically making pictographs and all this sort of stuff to be stricken from the record, it was a bold statement. And so we see stuff like that happen, and we see that even in the middle of the night, he's telling them, go, get out of here, leave now. And just as God had said, it was a Passover to eat with haste because they were going to be leaving and they weren't going to have time for anything else. And so here they left their dwellings in Egypt. They went and they left, just as God had said. Now, this isn't the end of the story of them leaving Egypt. There's still some more about it, but God showed himself truthful, and he showed the promise that he'd said. This last plague was one that they would remember, and they still remember to this day. The Passover is still critically important to anybody who is Jewish to this day, and yet, even for us who are Christians, this is such a sign of what Jesus was coming to do on the cross. That he was the Passover lamb, that he was the one that the blood of the lamb was going to take away their sins, that was going to seal them and keep us from God's wrath. And so we see this, and it's such an amazing thing that the Passover was pointing towards the ultimate Passover lamb in Jesus. And we see this wonderful piece, and we see this story in Sunday school, and we've heard about the 10 plagues and all this sort of stuff, and we see time and again how the world tries to figure out anything they could do to disprove or to say it was just all a coincidence. But the fact of the matter is God showed himself mighty in a way that is just beyond human comprehension. I mean, the the level of coincidence that would have to happen, it just it's too much. But yet people are so unwilling to see God and to say, "Thus saith the Lord," that they are willing to look for any other excuse. And so, as we see that stuff, I just pray that we would understand, we would see what the Lord has done, we would hold fast, and when we look at this world and we see it in chaos and confusion, that we wouldn't get discouraged. That our God, who is mighty to save the Israelites, is mighty to save and step in on our behalf as well. But we have to be faithful. We have to trust, and we need to be obedient. We need to do what the Lord has called us to do, and He has called His people to go and be witnesses. And so, as we close this chapter, as we close this study looking at these verses, I want to ask you, are you being obedient to the Lord? Are you doing what He has asked you to do? If you are looking, how can I go and be a witness? There is going to be such a great opportunity when we have trunk or treat here in the next couple of weeks. We are going to have the option or the ability for you to volunteer, to be a part, to share the gospel with kids, to tell them the wonderful news about Jesus and the one who loves them so very much. And so I hope that you will be willing to come out and volunteer for that. You can volunteer to hand out candy at a trunk and just put a smile on the face of kids. That we've had such a difficult couple of years here, that it is such a blessing just to put a smile on the face of kids. We're going to have the wonderful blessing of being able to have Bibles to share with kids. That's going to be just an awesome thing, to be able to share the good news with them and to have Bibles to put in their hands. And we're looking forward to this. And so I hope that you'll be a part of that. There's other places where you can serve and minister. Here in the church, we also have, Operation Christmas Child that we're still needing some supplies and stuff for, that you can help donate. And so if you're wondering about that, feel free to give a call to the church, call myself. We'd love to be able to talk to you about that. Otherwise, I hope that you have a great week. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this has been a blessing to you, and we just ask that you just keep the ministry of Calvary in prayer, and keep your own relationship with the Lord in prayer, and that the Lord would show you what He would have you to do, wherever in the world you may be, however things are for you, because no matter where you're at, no matter what you're doing, the Lord has a plan for you. That plan at first is to come to know Him as Lord and Savior. But once we have done that, He has a plan for you to be a witness for Him. And I hope that you're willing to say, "Yes, Lord," and do whatever He asks. Well, thank you so much for being with us. God bless you all. We'll see you next week.